The champagne was lukewarm, a cheap vintage masquerading behind a prestige label, much like the man standing to my left. I adjusted the cuff of my tuxedo, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against skin, more accustomed to the grit of pressurized sparks and the heavy weight of an arc welder's lead. In the aerospace hangar, precision is the only thing that keeps a fuselage from tearing apart at 30,000 feet. Here, in the hollowed-out ballroom of the Oaks Hotel, the structural integrity was failing, and I was the only one watching the stress fractures spread. Sloane looked radiant, though her smile had a brittle edge I'd only seen once before, when her father tried to talk her out of marrying a man who smelled like ozone and industrial degreaser. I squeezed her hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers. It wasn't nerves. It was the atmospheric pressure of my family. My brother, Preston, stood by the cake, preening. He wore a suit that cost more than my first truck, a shimmering charcoal number that screamed executive to anyone who didn't know how to read a balance sheet. He was 30, 2 years my senior, and had spent his entire life failing upward into cushions my mother meticulously placed beneath him. The room fell into that expectant, heavy silence that precedes a toast. It's the kind of silence that usually holds a sense of communal warmth, but today it felt like the air inside a vacuum chamber just before the pump kicks on. My mother, Miriam, stepped toward the microphone. She didn't walk. She drifted, her silk gown whispering against the floor like a warning. She adjusted the stand with a practiced, elegant hand, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't look at me. She looked at Preston, then at the rows of cousins and family friends who relied on her for social direction. "Everyone," she began, her voice amplified and honey-smooth. "Usually, a mother stands here and speaks of her son's journey. She speaks of his growth, his choices, and the partner he has found." I felt the first hairline crack. It wasn't a feeling of dread, but a cold, analytical observation. I knew that tone. It was the tone she used when she was about to correct a mistake. "Xander has always been industrious," Miriam continued, the word landing like a faint insult. "He works with his hands, he builds things that fly away, but sometimes, in his haste to build a life, he forgets the importance of stature. He forgets that a union is not just about a contract, it is about a legacy." She turned her head then, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes were hard, polished stones. "I look at Sloane," Miriam said, her voice rising. "I see her grace, her education, her family's standing, and I look at my sons. It is a mother's burden, to be honest, even when it is difficult. Sloane, you are an extraordinary woman. You are, quite frankly, too good for the life Xander can provide in a machine shop. If we are being honest, if we are looking at who truly fits the life you deserve, it has always been Preston who carries the weight of this family's future." A soft, collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. It was the sound of 100 people holding their breath at once. I felt Sloane's hand go limp in mine. I didn't flinch. I didn't redden. I simply watched the way the light caught the sweat on Preston's forehead as he took a half step forward, a modest, practiced, "Who, me?" smile playing on his lips. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting for his cue. "Preston understands the world of finance, of leadership," Miriam said, ignoring the stunned silence of the guests. "Xander is a laborer, a fine one, certainly, but a marriage is an investment, and I believe we all know which son is the blue chip." She stepped back, the microphone letting out a low, mournful hum of feedback. The humiliation was supposed to be the end of it. I was supposed to tuck my tail, perhaps shout, perhaps leave in a fit of disorganized rage, proving her point about my lack of stature. I looked at my brother. He was leaning against the head table now, radiating a smug, secondary heat. He thought he was the protagonist. He thought this was the moment the hero finally claims the prize that the lesser man had accidentally stumbled upon. Behind him, I saw our friends, Marcus and Greg. They weren't shocked. They were nodding. They had been the ones whispering in Preston's ear for months, providing the cover stories for his business trips, while he was actually burning through his savings at the tables in Atlantic City. They were the ones who had helped Miriam cultivate this narrative that I was a temporary fixture in my own life. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. My hand didn't shake. In my line of work, if your hand shakes, you ruin a $100,000 component. You learn to breathe through the heat. "Mom," I said, my voice unamplified but carrying through the air of the room. I walked toward the podium. Miriam didn't move. She stood her ground, an empress who had just delivered a decree. "That was an interesting assessment," I said, reaching the microphone. I didn't push her away. I just occupied the space next to her. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Miriam. You like the idea of legacy. You like the idea of stature. It's a shame you never bothered to look at the foundations." I pulled a thick manila envelope from my jacket. It was heavy, filled with the kind of reality that doesn't fit into a wedding toast. "Preston," I said, looking at my brother. "You look great in that suit. Truly, it's a charcoal wool blend, right? Retails for about $4,000, I know, because the charge hit the joint account you still share with Mom 3 weeks ago, the same account where the mortgage payments for this legacy are currently 3 months in arrears." Preston's smile didn't disappear. It curdled. "Xander, this isn't the place." "I think it's exactly the place," I interrupted, my voice as flat and precise as a laser level. "Since we're talking about who fits where, let's talk about your executive position at the firm. I called their HR department last Tuesday. They were very helpful. They informed me that you haven't worked there in 14 months. Apparently, there was an issue with the corporate credit card and a series of late-night withdrawals at a casino ATM. I started pulling documents from the envelope, laying them out on the linen-covered table like a deck of cards. "Here is the ledger from the gambling site you've been using," I said, sliding a printed spreadsheet toward the front row where the family elders sat. "Total losses over the last fiscal year, $218,000. And here," I slid another paper, "is the wire transfer history showing where that money came from. It didn't come from your investments, Preston. It came from Miriam's retirement fund, which she gave you power of attorney over last spring." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of a collapsing building. I watched my mother's face. The composure didn't just break, it evaporated. She turned to Preston, her mouth opening but no sound came out. "And for my friends, Marcus and Greg," I said, not even looking at them. "I have the phone logs. It's amazing what people discuss via text when they think the person they're talking about is too simple to check the family plan records. The jokes about how long it would take for me to notice the missing funds were particularly enlightening." I looked back at the room. The guests were staring at their laps, at their plates, at anything but the stage. The social fabric hadn't just torn, I had shredded it. "You wanted to talk about who carries the weight of this family, Miriam?" I asked, leaning into the microphone. "I'm an aerospace welder. I spend my days ensuring that when things are under extreme pressure, they don't fall apart. I've been paying the taxes on your house for 2 years. I've been topping off Preston's investment accounts so you wouldn't see the zeros. I was the structural support for this entire charade." I felt a strange sense of clarity. The underestimated husband, the simple laborer. I had spent years being the person they leaned on while they practiced their disdain for me. "But the thing about structural support," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless echoed, "is that once you realize the load is rotten, you stop bracing it." I turned to Sloane. She was standing by our table, her face pale, her eyes wide. She wasn't crying. She was watching me with a look I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the first time she was seeing the man I actually was, stripped of the undervalued label my family had pinned on me. "Sloane," I said, "the car is out front. The bags are already in the trunk. I have the papers for the private ceremony in my pocket. We can stay here and watch them try to figure out how to pay for this dinner with a maxed-out credit card, or we can go." I didn't wait for her answer. I knew her. I knew she had spent as much time suffocating under Miriam's guidance as I had. I looked at Preston one last time. He looked small. The suit didn't fit him anymore. It looked like a costume he'd stolen. Miriam was clutching the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her eyes darting between the printed bank records and the son she had just championed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I tapped a single button, sending a pre-written message to a contact list that included every person in this room, plus a few local business associates Preston had been trying to impress. The message contained a link to a secure drive with every document I had just laid on the table. The room erupted, not with voices, but with the synchronized, frantic chiming of 100 smartphones receiving a notification at once. It was the sound of a reputation being dismantled in real time. I stepped off the podium, the floor feeling solid beneath my feet for the first time in years. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the aftermath to know the wreckage was absolute. I walked toward the exit, my hand reaching out for Sloane's. The pressure was gone. The vacuum had been filled. The parking lot of the Oaks Hotel was a sea of polished asphalt and luxury sedans, but as Sloane and I walked toward my truck, it felt more like an extraction zone. Behind us, the ballroom was still vibrating with the digital chorus of 100 smartphones. It was a rhythmic, persistent sound, the electronic pulse of a social circle being forced to look at the grime beneath its fingernails. I didn't need to see the faces inside to know that the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to predatory. In that world, once a weakness is identified, the pack doesn't offer comfort. It begins to distance itself to avoid the contagion of failure. I opened the passenger door for Sloane. She climbed in, her silk dress rustling against the worn fabric of the seat. She hadn't spoken since we left the podium, but her breathing was steady. She wasn't crumbling, she was processing. I walked around to the driver's side, my boots crunching on the gravel. Before I climbed in, I looked back at the hotel entrance. Preston stumbled out of the revolving doors, his charcoal jacket unbuttoned and flapping in the evening breeze. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the lot until they locked onto my truck. He started toward me, his gait uneven, clutching his phone like a talisman that had lost its power. Behind him, Miriam appeared in the doorway, a silhouette of rigid, trembling fury. She didn't follow him into the light. She stayed in the shadows of the portico, watching her favored son unravel in the public eye. "Xander!" Preston shouted, his voice cracking. "Xander, wait! You can't just... That information, it's private. It's misleading." I leaned against the door of my truck, watching him approach. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a volatile gas. It expands and explodes, often hurting the one containing it. What I felt was the calm satisfaction of a finished weld, smooth, permanent, and cold. "It's not misleading, Preston," I said as he stopped a few feet away, heaving for breath. "It's a bank statement. Numbers don't have opinions. They don't have agendas. They just exist." "You ruined it," he hissed, his face contorting. "The merger, the investors. I had people in that room who were ready to sign. You've destroyed years of work. You haven't had a job in over a year, Preston. There was no merger. There were only more marks." I reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the original copy. "I didn't destroy your work. I just turned the lights on while you were stealing from the till." He looked at the ledger, then at me. For a moment, I saw the younger brother who used to hide his broken toys in my room so I'd get blamed for them. The tactic hadn't changed, only the stakes. "Mom is going to lose the house," he whispered, a desperate attempt to pivot to a guilt that no longer resided in me. "No," I corrected him. "You lost the house. I'm just the one who stopped paying the ransom to keep you in that suit." I got into the truck and started the engine. The rumble of the diesel motor drowned out whatever pathetic plea he tried to launch next. As I backed out of the space, I saw him standing there, illuminated by my headlights, a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of stolen credit, now facing the first night of a very long, very quiet reality. Sloane waited until we were a mile away from the hotel, the city lights beginning to blur into the background. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was thin but firm. "Since the Christmas party," I said. I found a statement Miriam left on the kitchen counter. She thought I wouldn't understand the terminology. She's always assumed that because I work with a torch, I don't know how to read a spreadsheet. It took me 3 months to trace the secondary accounts Preston set up to funnel her pension. And the friends, Marcus and Greg? They were getting a kickback, I explained, my eyes fixed on the road. Preston would consult for their firms. They'd bill a client for his non-existent expertise, and they'd split the fee. All of it funded by the money I was putting into the family trust to keep Miriam's lifestyle afloat. They thought I was the golden goose, Sloane. They just didn't realize the goose was taking notes. I pulled the truck into the driveway of a small, non-denominational chapel on the edge of town. There were no flowers, no ice sculptures, and no audience of judgmental relatives. There was only an elderly justice of the peace waiting by the door, and a sense of stillness that the Oaks Hotel could never have provided. "Are you sure?" I asked, turning to her. "I just dismantled my family. I'm not exactly the blue-chip investment Miriam was talking about." Sloane looked at the chapel, then back at me. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first real one I'd seen all day. "I never liked the Oaks," she said, "and I never liked charcoal suits." We were married in 20 minutes. No fanfare, no microphones, just a signature on a document that was actually worth the paper it was printed on. When we walked back out to the truck, the air felt different. The weight of the deception had been transferred. It wasn't my burden anymore. It was theirs. But the night wasn't over. A man like Preston doesn't just disappear when his cover is blown. He tries to find a new cover. And a woman like Miriam doesn't admit fault. She seeks a villain to justify her loss. My phone buzzed in the center console. It was a flurry of messages. Not from the guests, but from the inner circle. "Marcus, you think you're smart? You just ended your career in this town. No one hires a whistleblower who shames his own mother." "Greg, we can fix this, Xander. Delete the drive. Tell them it was a mistake, a technical glitch. We can talk about a settlement." I didn't reply. I opened my banking app. I had spent the last 72 hours moving my personal assets into an offshore entity that Preston's executive brain couldn't track. I watched the final transfer clear. The family trust, the one I had been inflating for years, was now sitting at exactly $0. "Where to now?" Sloane asked. "One last stop," I said. "I need to collect some tools from the shop." The aerospace hangar was a cavernous, echoing space at midnight. The smell of metal and argon gas always calmed me. It was a place of objective truths. A weld is either sound or it is flawed. There is no middle ground, no social nuance. I walked to my locker and pulled out a heavy industrial-grade thermal cutter. I also grabbed a folder from the secure drawer. It contained the titles to the 3 vehicles currently parked at Miriam's estate, the ones I had paid for, but put in my name for insurance purposes. "What are you doing, Xander?" Sloane asked, standing in the doorway of the shop. "I'm reclaiming my materials," I said. "Preston thinks he can leave town tonight. He's already packed. I saw the suitcases in his trunk when he walked out of the hotel. He's going to try to take Miriam's remaining jewelry and the car I bought last year to get to his friend's cabin in the woods." "You're going to stop him?" "No," I said, checking the fuel level on the cutter. "I'm going to make sure he stays exactly where he belongs, in the mess he created." We drove to Miriam's house. It was a sprawling colonial, a monument to a status she could no longer afford. The lights were on in every room. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, the frantic, jerky movements of people who realize the floor has dropped out from under them. Preston's car, my car technically, was idling in the driveway. I saw him through the windshield, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights as he frantically spoke into his phone, likely begging Marcus or Greg for a place to hide. I parked the truck at the end of the curb, out of sight. I didn't approach him. I didn't need a confrontation. I walked to the utility box at the edge of the property. With a few precise movements of the thermal cutter, I severed the main fiber optic line and the copper phone wires. The house didn't go dark, but it became an island. No internet, no landline, just a house full of secrets and no way to broadcast them. Then, I walked to the driveway. Preston was so engrossed in his panicked conversation that he didn't see me approach the rear of the vehicle. I didn't slash the tires. That would be petty and easily fixed. Instead, I knelt and applied the thermal cutter to the rear axle housing. It was a surgical strike, a clean, deep score that wouldn't be visible to a casual glance, but would cause the structural failure of the drivetrain the moment the car hit 30 miles per hour. He wasn't going to the cabin. He wasn't going anywhere. I stood up and walked back to the truck. As I pulled away, I saw the front door of the house fly open. Miriam stood on the porch, clutching a cordless phone to her ear, staring at it in confusion as she realized the dial tone was gone. She looked out into the darkness, searching for the sun she had spent her life suppressing, but all she saw were the receding taillights of a truck that no longer belonged to her world. "Is it done?" Sloan asked as we hit the highway, the city skyline finally disappearing in the rearview mirror. "The preparation is done," I said, my voice steady. "Now we just wait for the weight to settle. Tomorrow the bank realizes the trust is empty. The day after, the foreclosure notice arrives. And Preston has to explain to the police why he's driving a vehicle with a tampered axle that I reported stolen an hour ago." I looked at my hands. They were clean. No grease, no soot. Just the steady hands of a man who knew how to build things to last and how to ensure the things that weren't worth saving finally fell apart. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a man who had finally finished a long, grueling shift at the furnace, stepping out into the cool night air. The coastal air was sharp and carried the scent of salt, a stark contrast to the stagnant, expensive perfume that usually clogged Miriam's hallways. Sloan and I sat in a small diner 40 miles north of the city, the kind of place where the formica tables are worn smooth by decades of honest work. I had my laptop open, the screen glowing with a series of digital folders I had been assembling like the components of a complex engine. To dismantle a lie, you have to understand its architecture. You have to see where the weight was shifted and which pillars were hollowed out. As I scrolled through years of scanned documents, the true scope of the reconstruction began to take shape. It wasn't just a few months of gambling debts, it was a decade of systematic erasure. "Look at this," I said, turning the screen toward Sloan. "This is from 5 years ago, the year I finished my apprenticeship and got my first contract at the hangar." On the screen was a series of bank transfers from my primary savings account. They were small, incremental amounts, $200 here, $500 there. At the time, I had noticed the discrepancies, but Miriam had always brushed it off as administrative fees for the family account she managed for me. I had trusted her because that is what a son is taught to do. She wasn't just taking the money, Sloan noted, her eyes scanning the dates. She was redirecting it. See the recipient? The funds weren't going into a general household fund. They were being funneled into a private tutoring service and a high-end tailoring house. Miriam was literally using my sweat to buy the stature she claimed I lacked. Every hour I spent hunched over a welding torch, inhaling the metallic tang of vaporized steel, was an hour she spent polishing Preston. She was crafting him into the image of the successful son, using my resources to pay for the suit he wore to the weddings and the country club memberships he used to network with people who wouldn't look at me twice. "It's a feedback loop," I said, my voice low and analytical. "She used my earnings to build his persona, then used that persona to justify why he deserved more of the family's respect. The more I worked, the more invisible I became, because the visible result of my labor was draped over Preston's shoulders. I opened another folder. This one contained emails I'd retrieved from a discarded laptop of Preston's I'd fixed for him 3 years ago. I hadn't looked then, but the data was still on the drive. The correspondence was with Marcus and Greg. They weren't just assisting him, they were coaching him. They showed him how to manipulate the narrative of our father's modest estate, how to frame me as the unreliable sibling who needed to be managed, and how to position Preston as the stable conservator. One email from Marcus stood out. Xander is too busy playing with his sparklers to notice the shift. Keep him on the overtime shifts. The more he's at the shop, the less he's at the bank. They orchestrated the overtime, I realized, a cold clarity settling over me. Marcus's father is on the board of the aerospace firm. He was the one pushing the hangar manager to keep me on the night rotations. They wanted me tired. They wanted me out of the house. They wanted me distracted by the physical exhaustion of the job so I wouldn't have the mental energy to check the ledger. I felt the structural integrity of my past memories buckling. The times I'd missed family dinners because of emergencies at work weren't accidents, they were tactical maneuvers. I had been a prisoner of my own work ethic, a man walking a treadmill while my family moved the house around me. But they missed one thing, Sloan said, pointing to a line of code in the corner of one of the documents. They didn't realize you were the one who installed the security updates on the family server. I nodded. In my world, if you don't verify your connections, things fail. I set up a mirrored log for every transaction involving my social security number. They thought they were moving numbers in a vacuum. They didn't realize they were leaving a digital footprint on a drive they didn't even know existed. The diner door opened, and a gust of wind ruffled the napkins on our table. I checked my phone. The tracker I'd placed on the car, the one I'd officially reported as unauthorized for use, was stationary. Preston was currently sitting on the shoulder of the highway, 10 miles from Miriam's house. The thermal score I'd made on the axle would have yielded right as he tried to accelerate onto the main artery. He wouldn't be able to move the vehicle, and within the hour, the highway patrol would be running the plates. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared. Xander, it's Miriam. Your brother has been in an accident. The car just... It stopped working. He's stranded and the police are being very difficult about the registration. Please, call me. We need the insurance information. I deleted the message. I wasn't providing insurance. I wasn't providing a tow. I was providing a consequence. What's the next move? Sloan asked. We go back, I said. Not to the house, to the office. The offices of Preston and Associates, a firm that consisted of nothing but a rented desk in a shared workspace and a very impressive-looking glass door, were located in the downtown district. I still had the key card Preston had given me once when he wanted me to drop off a sensitive document, which turned out to be his dry cleaning. We arrived at the building at 2 a.m. The lobby was empty, the marble floors gleaming under the dim security lights. We bypassed the elevators and took the stairs. Inside the shared office space, the air was still and smelled of stale coffee. I headed straight for the filing cabinets in the back. Preston was arrogant, but he was also lazy. He didn't like digital clutter, so he kept physical copies of the contracts he used to trick Miriam into giving him more money. I found the file labeled Legacy Trust. Inside were the forged signatures. He had been signing my name on loan applications, using my steady income and high credit score as collateral for personal lines of credit. He had even used my signature to co-sign a lease on a luxury apartment for a client who didn't exist. It was actually a space he used for his gambling parties. He didn't just take the money, Sloan, I said, holding up a document that made my grip tighten. He was trying to default on these. Look at the payment schedule. He set them up to trigger a massive delinquency right about now. He was going to let my credit rating be destroyed so I'd be forced to move back into Miriam's basement, where she could keep me working to pay off the debt while he managed the restructuring. It was a perfect loop of servitude. I would have been the engine, and they would have been the drivers, forever. I took out my portable scanner and began digitizing every page. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was a multi-year racketeering scheme. Every document was a brick in the wall I was building around them. As we were leaving, I noticed a small, framed photo on Preston's desk. It was of him, Marcus, and Greg at a golf tournament. They were all laughing, holding trophies they hadn't earned. I didn't smash the frame. I didn't throw it. I simply took the photo out, turned it over, and wrote a single date on the back, today's date. I left it on the center of the desk. We walked back to the truck. The city was starting to wake up, the first gray light of morning touching the tops of the skyscrapers. I felt a sense of heavy, deliberate momentum. "Xander," Sloane said as we got into the truck, "you know they're going to fight back. Miriam doesn't know how to exist without a sense of superiority. She'll try to spin this to the rest of the family. She'll say, you're unstable." "Let her," I said. "A narrative is just a story. A contract is a fact. I'm done competing with her stories. I'm just going to enforce the contracts." I started the engine. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a series of frantic messages from Greg. "The police are at Preston's car. They found the jewelry in the trunk, Xander, Miriam's jewelry. Why did you report the car stolen? This is going too far. We can still handle this quietly." I typed my first and only reply of the night. "I'm not a quiet man anymore, Greg. I'm a loud one. Watch the news." I drove toward the industrial park, where the local newspaper and the regional news station were headquartered. I had a courier envelope ready. It contained the bank ledgers, the forged loan documents, and a detailed breakdown of the gambling debts, all cross-referenced with the public records of the executives who were currently holding seats on the local Chamber of Commerce. I wasn't just going to take their money. I was going to take the air they breathed, the social oxygen of respectability and status that they valued more than anything else. As I dropped the envelope into the secure overnight bin, I felt a vibration in the ground, a distant train perhaps, or just the weight of the truth finally hitting the pavement. I looked at the hangar in the distance, my place of work, where I had spent thousands of hours building things that were meant to withstand the heavens. I realized then that I wasn't the underdog anymore. I was the architect. And the demolition was proceeding exactly according to the blueprint. "One more thing," I said to Sloane as we pulled away. "We need to visit the bank when they open. I have a feeling Miriam is going to try to withdraw the last of the emergency funds I left in her personal account." "Are you going to stop her?" "No," I said, a grim smile forming. "I'm going to let her, because that account isn't funded by me anymore. It's an overdraft line tied directly to Preston's gambling debts. The moment she touches it, she's not taking money. She's acknowledging the debt as her own." The trap was set, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one caught in the gears. I was the one turning them. The morning sun hit the glass of the downtown bank with a clinical, unforgiving glare. It was the kind of light that revealed every smudge and every imperfection, much like the digital paper trail I had been tracing since the wedding. Sloane stayed in the truck, her presence a silent anchor in the mounting turbulence. I walked through the heavy glass doors, the air conditioning hitting me with a sterile chill that felt like a premonition of the day to come. I took a seat in the waiting area, positioned perfectly to see the teller line and the manager's glass-walled office. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 9:15, the heavy oak doors of the entrance swung open, and Miriam marched in. She looked like a woman who was trying to outrun a storm. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, but the hand clutching her designer handbag was white-knuckled. Behind her followed Marcus, looking less like a supportive friend and more like a nervous accomplice. They didn't see me. I was just another man in a work jacket, a laborer waiting for a transaction. Miriam approached the teller with an air of practiced authority that was beginning to fray at the edges. "I need to make a substantial withdrawal from the household trust," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the soft chime of the bank's background music. The teller, a young woman who had likely never faced Miriam's particular brand of social pressure, tapped at her keyboard. I watched the teller's expression shift from polite professionalism to confusion, then to a guarded neutrality. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling," the teller said softly. "That account has a flag on it. I need to get my manager." I saw Marcus lean in, whispering something to Miriam. She snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide with a frantic, silent demand for an explanation. The manager, a man named Henderson, whom I had specifically briefed 2 days prior, emerged from his office. He didn't lead them to a private room. He spoke to them right there, in the semi-public space of the lobby. "Mrs. Sterling," Henderson said, his voice even. "The account you're referencing was restructured yesterday afternoon. As per the new terms of the joint liability agreement signed by your son, Preston, any withdrawal from this line of credit triggers a consolidated debt collection process." "What are you talking about?" Miriam demanded, her voice rising an octave. "It's my account. My son manages it for the family." "Actually," Henderson said, sliding a document across the counter, "this account is currently linked to a series of defaulted personal loans and outstanding gambling markers transferred from an offshore clearinghouse. By attempting to access these funds, you are legally acknowledging the consolidation of those debts onto your personal assets. If you sign for this withdrawal, you are essentially signing for the liability of $300,000 in high-interest debt." Miriam froze. She looked at the paper as if it were a coiled snake. Marcus backed away a half step, his hands raised in a gesture of sudden, cowardly distance. I didn't know," Miriam stammered. Preston said whatever he needed to say to keep the lights on," I said, standing up and walking toward them. The silence that followed was heavy. Miriam turned, her face a mask of shock that quickly curdled into a familiar, sharp-tongued resentment. "Xander, you did this. You went behind our backs and meddled with things you don't understand." "I understand them perfectly, Miriam," I said, stopping a few feet away. "I understand that you were willing to let Preston drain my future to fund a lifestyle that ended years ago. But here's the thing you missed. Preston wasn't the architect. He's too impulsive, too desperate for approval. He couldn't have set up the shell companies or the redirection of my payroll on his own. He doesn't have the patience for it." I looked at Marcus. He looked like he wanted to bolt for the door, but the security guard was positioned near the entrance. "Marcus here was the one who handled the paperwork," I continued. "He's the one who knew which bankers to talk to, which documents to misplace. But even Marcus wouldn't have done it without a guarantee, and that guarantee didn't come from Preston." I pulled a small digital recorder from my pocket. It was an older model, the kind used for dictation. I pressed play. "He won't notice, Marcus." Miriam's voice came through the small speaker, clear and sharp. "Xander expects so little from life. He's content with his sparks and his metal. If we move the funds slowly, he'll just think it's the cost of the house. He owes me that much for the life I've provided." The recording continued, detailing a conversation from 6 months ago where Miriam explicitly instructed Marcus on how to frame me as financially incompetent to the rest of the family if I ever started asking questions. Miriam didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply grew smaller, the air leaving her lungs in a long, rattling hiss. The traitor friend wasn't Marcus. It was the mother who had spent my entire life convincing me that I was the one who was lucky to be part of her legacy. "You recorded me?" she whispered. "In my own home?" "In the home I paid for," I corrected her, "using the security system I installed and maintained. You see, when you treat someone like they're part of the furniture, you forget that the furniture has ears." Marcus tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Xander, listen. I was just doing what I was told. I can help you fix this. I have records of the other accounts Preston opened." I already have them, Marcus, I said. And I've already sent them to the state licensing board for your firm. I imagine they'll be very interested in how an associate at your level was facilitating the embezzlement of a private citizen's funds. Marcus's face went gray. He turned and walked out of the bank, his shoulders slumped, leaving Miriam standing alone at the counter. "What now?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual polish. "Now," I said. "You go home and wait for the movers. I've purchased the debt on the house through a secondary holding company. You won't be living there anymore. I'm converting the property into a series of affordable units for the local trade apprentices. It seems fitting that the house you built on my labor will finally house people who actually do some." I turned to leave, but I stopped at the door. "Oh, and Miriam? Preston isn't at the cabin. He's currently at the county station. It turns out the jewelry he had in the trunk of my car belonged to several of your socialite friends. He'd been hawking the real stones and replacing them with glass for months. They've already identified the pieces." The look on her face wasn't one of concern for her son. It was a look of pure, unadulterated horror at the loss of her social standing. To her, Preston's crime wasn't the theft. It was the getting caught. I walked back out to the truck. Sloane looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Was it enough?" she asked. "No," I said, starting the engine. "Exposure is just the first step. For people like them, the real loss is when the world stops looking at them altogether. We have one more stop. The Regional Trade Convention is tonight. That's where the real architect was going to secure the final piece of the puzzle." "I thought you said Miriam was the architect." "She was the manager," I said, shifting into gear. "But the person who gave her the idea, the person who told her exactly how to manipulate me, is someone she hasn't mentioned once. Someone who's been sitting in the background, watching the whole thing play out like a game of chess." We drove toward the convention center, a massive glass and steel structure on the other side of the city. This was the professional gathering where Preston was supposed to debut his new venture, a venture funded by my stolen retirement and backed by the silent partner who had been pulling the strings from the start. As we arrived, the parking lot was filled with the vehicles of the city's industrial and financial elite. I saw the banners hanging from the rafters, the future of regional infrastructure. I checked my pocket. I had the final set of documents, the ones that linked the entire scheme to a name that would shock the room. It wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a corporate hit designed to keep me from ever rising high enough to challenge the status quo of the local industry. I walked toward the entrance, but a hand caught my arm. I turned to see Greg. He looked disheveled, his expensive tie loosened. "Xander, don't go in there," he whispered, his eyes darting around. "You don't know who you're dealing with. It's not just Preston and your mother. There are people in that room who have a lot to lose if you start talking about the contracts." "Good," I said, shaking his hand off. "I've spent 10 years making sure other people's designs don't fail. I think it's time I started testing the stress points on a few of theirs." "They'll ruin you," Greg warned. "They already tried," I said. "They just didn't realize that when you spend your life at the furnace, you stop being afraid of the heat." I pushed through the double doors. The room was a sea of suits and cocktail dresses, the sound of networking a low, persistent hum. On the stage, a man was speaking, a man I recognized from the board meetings at the hangar. He was talking about innovation and legacy. I didn't wait for him to finish. I walked straight to the tech booth at the back of the hall. The young technician looked up, startled. "I have the updated presentation for the Sterling keynote," I said, handing him a thumb drive. "Preston asked me to bring it in. He's running late." The technician, seeing my work jacket and my calm, authoritative demeanor, didn't hesitate. He plugged the drive in. I stood in the shadows as the screen on the stage flickered and changed. It didn't show the blueprints for a new infrastructure project. It showed a high-resolution scan of a contract between the speaker on the stage and my mother, Miriam, dated 3 years ago. It was an agreement to keep my wages suppressed and my promotions blocked in exchange for a percentage of the family trust that was being funneled back into the speaker's own shell companies. The room went silent. The man on the stage turned, his face going from a healthy tan to a sickly, mottled white as he saw his own signature projected 30 feet high. I looked at the crowd. I didn't see people. I saw components in a failing system, and I was the one with the torch. The cliffhanger wasn't what I would say next. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I didn't have to say anything at all. The truth was doing the work for me, and the structure was coming down exactly as I had planned. The silence in the convention hall was a heavy, physical thing, the kind of vacuum that exists in the seconds after a catastrophic structural failure. I stood in the back, the glow of the projection screen casting a blue light over the expensive suits and the frozen faces of the city's industrial elite. On the stage, the man who had been my ultimate superior, the architect of my stagnant career, clutched the lectern as if it were a life raft. He looked at the contract on the screen, then his eyes scanned the dark room, searching for the source of the leak. He didn't see me. I was just a shadow in a canvas jacket, a part of the machinery he had assumed was too simple to fight back. I turned and walked out of the hall before the shouting started. I had no interest in the verbal fallout. In my line of work, once the integrity of a joint is compromised beyond repair, you don't stay to watch the collapse. You move to the next point of failure. Sloan was waiting by the truck, the engine idling. The morning was transitioning into a sharp, clear afternoon. "It's all over the local feeds," she said, holding up her phone. "The news station you visited this morning just ran the first segment. They're calling it the Sterling Syndicate. They have the bank records and the recordings." "The social collapse is a byproduct," I said, climbing into the driver's seat. "But the real leverage is the physical assets. We need to reach the estate before the lawyers start filing for injunctions." The drive back to my mother's neighborhood felt like traversing a different world. The quiet, manicured lawns and the stone gates that had always seemed like symbols of permanent security now looked like the flimsy sets of a theater production. I knew exactly how much debt was leveraged against every brick in those walls. As we pulled into the driveway of the Sterling estate, I saw a familiar car, a sleek European sedan belonging to my brother's business associates. But it wasn't Preston behind the wheel. It was a courier. He was unloading boxes from the front porch, moving with a frantic, uncoordinated haste. Miriam was standing in the doorway, her silk wrap fluttering in the wind. She looked gaunt, the elegant mask of the family matriarch having slipped to reveal a woman who had gambled her children's futures and lost. When she saw my truck, she didn't run. She stood her ground, her chin tilted up in a final, desperate attempt at defiance. "You've had your fun, Xander," she said, as I stepped out of the truck. Her voice was brittle. "You've embarrassed your brother, you've humiliated me, and you've ruined a man who has done more for this city than you ever will. Are you satisfied?" "I'm not looking for satisfaction, Miriam. I'm looking for the deed to the property," I said. I held up a folder containing the purchase agreement for the secondary debt. "The bank has already processed the transfer. This house, the grounds, and the outbuildings are now owned by a holding company under my name. You have 3 hours to remove your personal effects. The furniture, the art, and the vehicles are currently under a lien to cover Preston's defaults." "You would put your own mother on the street?" she hissed. "I'm putting you in the reality you created," I replied. "You spent 10 years telling me that I was a laborer and that my contribution was secondary to the family's image. Well, the image has been liquidated. All that's left is the labor." I walked past her into the foyer. The house felt cold, the heating system likely having been shut off by the utility company after months of unpaid balances. I headed for the library, the room where my father used to sit, and where Miriam had spent years managing the accounts I had funded. The safe in the wall was open. Preston had already been here, likely before the police caught up with him at the car. He had cleaned out the cash and the easily transportable valuables, but he had left the one thing he didn't value: the original contracts of the family trust. I gathered the remaining documents, the physical proof of every redirected paycheck and every forged signature. My phone rang. It was an unrecognized number, but I knew the prefix. It was the county station. Xander? Preston's voice was high-pitched, bordering on a sob. Xander, you have to help me. They're talking about grand larceny and fraud. They say the car was reported stolen. I told them it was a mistake, that we're family. Just call them. Tell them you gave me permission. I didn't give you permission, Preston, I said, my voice flat. I gave you a chance to be the man you pretended to be. You chose to be a thief instead. Mom will lose everything if I go to trial. Think about her. She's already lost it, I said. She's currently standing on the porch watching a courier take away her jewelry boxes. And Preston? I'm the one who tipped off the owners of the jewelry you swapped for glass. They're waiting at the station to file their own statements. I ended the call and looked at the room one last time. This house had been a cage, a place where my worth was measured in how much I could be drained. I felt a profound sense of lightness as I walked out, the heavy folder under my arm. Outside, the situation had escalated. A second car had arrived, a black SUV. A man stepped out, someone I hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. He was the silent partner Greg had mentioned, a developer who had been using Miriam's social connections to facilitate land grabs for a new industrial park. Mr. Sterling, the man said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. I think you and I have things to discuss. You've caused a significant amount of financial turbulence in the last 6 hours. My clients are not pleased. Your clients don't exist, I said, not slowing my pace toward the truck. I looked into your development firm. It's a series of shell companies funded by the very pension funds my mother was helping you access. You weren't building an industrial park. You were laundering the city's trade union retirement accounts. The man's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened. That's a very dangerous accusation to make without a lawyer present. I don't need a lawyer, I said. I have the transfer codes. You see, when you recruited Preston to be your executive face, you didn't realize he was using my home computer to log into your servers. He wanted to feel important, so he kept copies of everything. He thought it was his insurance policy against you. It turns out, it's my evidence against both of you. I pulled a small, ruggedized tablet from my jacket and turned the screen toward him. It showed a real-time map of his firm's accounts, most of which were currently being frozen by the federal authorities I had contacted from the diner. The turbulence hasn't even started yet, I said. By tomorrow morning, every contractor in the city will know that their retirement is gone because you and Miriam wanted to play at being royalty. The man looked at Miriam, then back at me. He saw the truth in my eyes, the cold, unwavering focus of a man who knows exactly how much heat a structure can take before it melts. He didn't say another word. He got back into his SUV and drove away, leaving Miriam standing in the dust of his departure. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with a sudden, calculated moisture. Xander, please, I was wrong. I was blinded by the idea of what we could be. I did it for all of us. I wanted you to have a name that meant something. My name means I do what I say I'm going to do, I said. And I said I was done. I got into the truck. Sloane was looking out the window, her hand resting on the dashboard. She didn't look at Miriam. She was looking at the horizon, at the life we were finally going to start on our own terms. Wait! Miriam cried out, running toward the truck as I shifted into gear. I have no money. Preston took the last of the cash. How am I supposed to live? I looked at her, and for a fleeting second, I saw the mother who had tucked me in and told me stories. But then I remembered the recording. I remembered the 10 years of overtime. I remembered the way she had looked at Sloane at the wedding, the sheer, unadulterated contempt for a woman who loved me for who I actually was. There's a job opening at the hangar, I said. They need someone to clean the floors in the evening shift. It's honest work, Miriam. It pays by the hour. You always said I was industrious. Maybe it's time you tried it. I drove out of the gate, the tires crunching over the gravel for the last time. As we hit the main road, I saw a fleet of moving trucks heading in the opposite direction. The liquidation had begun. The Sterling legacy was being packed into boxes and hauled away to pay for a decade of lies. "Where are we going?" Sloan asked. "To the shop," I said. "I have one final meeting. I invited everyone, Marcus, Greg, the board members, even the district attorney. I told them I had the master key to the encrypted drive." "Do you?" "I am the master key," I said. We drove through the industrial district, the sun setting behind the skeletons of the half-finished buildings. The world felt quiet, expectant. The trap was fully set, the pieces were in motion, and there was only one move left to make. I checked the time. 6 o'clock, the exact time the wedding reception was supposed to have ended. Instead of a dance, there was going to be a reckoning. And instead of a toast, there would be a final, irreversible silence. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands steady and sure. I was no longer the man who built things to fly away. I was the man who had built a cage, and I was about to turn the lock. The hangar smelled of cold grease and ionized air, a familiar sanctuary that had finally become a courtroom. I stood at the center of the bay, beneath the towering shadow of a half-finished fuselage. The overhead mercury vapor lights hummed with a low, electrical thrum, casting long, stark shadows across the concrete floor. I had arranged the room with a welder's precision, a single table, a laptop, and a perimeter of heavy industrial equipment that made the space feel cramped and inescapable. They arrived in stages, like debris caught in a slow-moving current. Marcus and Greg were the first, looking haggard and stripped of their usual bravado. Then came the man from the convention stage, his expensive coat now rumpled, followed by 2 representatives from the district attorney's office, who stood in the shadows, silent and observant. Finally, Miriam appeared. She was flanked by a court-appointed officer, her posture finally broken, her eyes darting around the steel cavern as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. "You said there was a master key," the man from the convention said, his voice echoing against the corrugated metal walls. "You said if we came here, we could settle the matter of the digital evidence." "I said the truth was in this room," I corrected him. I didn't move from my position by the laptop. "The evidence isn't just a file, Henderson. It's a sequence of events. It's the history of how a group of supposedly intelligent people convinced themselves that a man who works with his hands is too simple to notice when he's being dismantled." I tapped a key on the laptop. A series of monitors mounted on the wall flickered to life. They didn't show bank statements this time. They showed live feeds of the estate, where the local sheriff's department was currently loading the last of the furniture into a state-contracted truck. They showed the digital freezing of the offshore accounts Marcus had tried to hide. And they showed the booking photo of Preston, stripped of his charcoal suit and his dignity. "This isn't a settlement," Marcus stammered, stepping forward. "This is an ambush. Xander, you're interfering with ongoing financial restructures. We can tie you up in litigation for years." "With what money?" I asked, my voice flat and resonant. "The firm is gone, Marcus. The board voted an hour ago to dissolve the partnership and cooperate with the investigation. Greg was the one who gave them the passwords. He traded your involvement for a recommendation of leniency." Marcus turned to Greg, his mouth agape. Greg wouldn't look at him. He simply stared at the floor, a man who had finally realized that loyalty among thieves is a liquid asset. I looked at Miriam. She was watching the screen that showed her house being emptied. A single, heavy tear tracked through the powder on her cheek, but she remained silent. She knew the mechanics of this. She knew that once the structural integrity is gone, the only thing left to do is watch the collapse. "You all thought I was the resource," I said, walking slowly around the table. "You thought I was a constant, a battery you could plug into whenever your own lives ran low on fuel. You built your status on my fatigue. You built your legacy on my silence. I stopped in front of Henderson. You suppressed my wages for 3 years to keep the union from noticing your embezzlement. You used my mother's greed to keep me grounded, thinking that if I stayed an apprentice, I'd never have the authority to audit the books. It was business, Sterling, Henderson hissed, though his confidence was a paper-thin veneer. Everyone in this city plays the same game. You're just the one who decided to ruin it for everyone else. I didn't ruin it, I said. I just finished the job. In welding, there's a term for what you did. It's called a cold lap. It's when the metal doesn't actually fuse. It just sits on top, looking solid until the first sign of real pressure. You were all cold laps. You looked like a family. You looked like friends. You looked like a career. But at the first sign of a real load, you fell apart. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a digital drive, encased in reinforced steel. I laid it on the table. Everything is on here, I said. The forged signatures, the wire transfers, the recorded conversations where you planned the restructuring of my life. The DA's office already has the encryption codes. This meeting wasn't for negotiation. It was for observation. I turned to the representatives in the shadows. The evidence is authenticated. The physical assets have been secured. The debt is consolidated. One of the officers stepped forward, unfolding a series of documents. Miriam Sterling, Marcus Vane, Arthur Henderson, you are being served with a formal freeze of all personal and professional assets pending the outcome of the racketeering investigation. You are required to remain in the jurisdiction. The room erupted into a cacophony of panicked excuses and legal threats, but I tuned it out. I looked at the fuselage behind me. It was built with precision. It was built to withstand the vacuum. It was built to last. I walked toward the side door where Sloane was waiting. She was holding my work bag and the keys to the truck. She looked at the chaos in the center of the hangar and then at me. There was no need for a conversation. We had said everything that needed to be said at the chapel. Wait! Miriam's voice rose above the shouting. She broke away from the officer and ran toward me, her hands outstretched. Xander, you can't leave it like this. I'm your mother. You're a Sterling. This name has to mean something. I paused with my hand on the door handle. I looked back at her, at the woman who had endorsed my brother's theft while I stood at the altar. I looked at the people who had treated my life like a ledger to be balanced in their favor. The name doesn't mean anything anymore, Miriam, I said. I've already filed the paperwork. I'm taking Sloane's name. As of this morning, the Sterlings are out of business. I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was crisp and smelled of rain, a clean, sharp scent that washed away the ozone and the grease. Behind me, the heavy steel door of the hangar slid shut with a final, echoing thud, sealing the Sterlings inside the ruin of their own making. I climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, a steady, powerful vibration that felt like a heartbeat. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the industrial park. I didn't check the news alerts on my phone. I didn't wonder where they would go or how they would survive the coming storm. The project was finished. The welds were cooled. The structure had been tested to the point of failure, and it had been found wanting. We hit the highway, the lights of the city becoming a distant, fading glow. Ahead of us, the road was a long, dark ribbon stretching into a future where no one knew my name, and no one expected me to carry their weight. I reached over and took Sloane's hand. Her grip was firm and sure. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't an underdog, a strategist, or a villain. I was just a man driving into the night, leaving a ghost story in the wake of my taillights. The silence in the cab was absolute, a perfect, unshakable peace.